This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Grandmaster Vasyl Ivanchuk taking on Grandmaster Alexander Grischuk at the 2012 FIDE World Blitz Championship. These are two legends of blitz chess and, of course, of classical chess as well. It's going to be an interesting game. And we start out with a sort of King's Indian Benoni type of structure. Grischuk with the early c5, and Ivanchuk deciding to keep his pawn on d4, and there's that trade. C takes d4, knight takes d4, and now we've transposed into something resembling kind of an English structure with that white pawn on c4 clamping down on the d5 square. So in these types of positions, black often tries to play d5 in one fell swoop, and that is exactly what Alexander Grischuk does. Now, there is a well-known repetition in this position that starts with c takes d5, knight takes d5, and then white's d4 knight jumps out to b5. But something tells me Ivanchuk is going to try to find a way to keep this game going, but he's already taking a significant chunk of time, 30 seconds down on the clock against Grischuk. You don't hear that every day. Now, c takes d5 seems very natural, and a little hesitation there from Vasyl, as he grabs his head in his hands and continues to ponder his next move. He's now 45 seconds down. I don't really see any viable alternatives to taking on d5, and he finally does take on d5. Perhaps he was thinking about the next move, and instead of knight b5, he drops the knight back to b3, a more modest continuation. Now the knight on d5 is hanging. Where is it going to retreat? You can also defend the knight with the move pawn to e6, but that would lock the light-squared bishop in on c8, and that's not to Grischuk's liking, as he drops his knight to the corresponding square on b6, knight c3, knight c6, and now the position is fully symmetrical, but that does not mean that this game is going to end in a quick draw. The center is wide open. There's the possibility of a queen trade. There is a lot of tension, and Ivanchuk confidently develops his dark-squared bishop to f4. He has completed his minor piece development, and Alexander Grischuk says, I like that idea. He does exactly the same thing. Now, the big question is going to be, who is actually going to initiate the queen trade? How long are we going to see the queens staring at each other? The reason I don't think white is going to do it is because taking on d8 gives black control over the d file, so both sides want the other side to actually be the one to trade. But no, Ivanchuk does trade queens, and I think that surprised Grischuk a little bit as he is trying to figure out which piece to recapture with. My guess is that Ivanchuk wants to position his b3 knight on c5 and put tremendous pressure on that b7 pawn. That is precisely what he does. A very ingenious idea by Ivanchuk, as he does give up control over the d file, but puts significant pressure on Grischuk's queenside, necessitating the light-squared bishop to move back to c8 in order to defend b7. And now Ivanchuk says, give me that d file back, as he moves his a1 rook over to d1. And it does seem to me that white has managed to achieve a rather significant edge here in the endgame. Grischuk with a cheeky knight maneuver there to c4. The position remains very much symmetrical, and now it's Ivanchuk's b2 pawn which is under fire. And is he going to have to bring his bishop back to c1 as well? No, knight c3. Hesitation there as he moves his knight back. He's going to have to move that knight, and he does indeed move it to a4. A little bit of an awkward square for the knight, but that knight does defend the b2 pawn. Grischuk could take that pawn anyway because he's got two attackers on it, but he instead decides to centralize his other knights, and maybe this is what caused Ivanchuk to hesitate. Now Grischuk's knights look rather imposing indeed, and Ivanchuk continuing to fall behind on the clock. He's now down a full minute with his e2 pawn hanging, and not only is it hanging, it's hanging with check. He cannot give that pawn away, or can he? He does, but instead he takes the pawn on b7. But that seems to be an admission that something has gone wrong here for white. Now Grischuk could grab that pawn on e2 with check, and then he can eliminate white's dark-squared bishop, simultaneously permanently ruining white's kingside pawn structure. So now I'm thinking that black is the one pulling for an advantage, especially given the situation on the clock. But Grischuk is not rushing. He's probably trying to decide on the order of operations. There's a lot of pieces that he could take, and he does indeed take the pawn and then the bishop. Now, will he take the other bishop on b7 and perhaps move the d8 rook over to b8 and focus his efforts on eliminating the b2 pawn? Or is he going to try to keep his bishop pair intact with a move like bishop c8 to f5? A lot of choices to be made here for Sasha Grischuk. He could also take the pawn on b2 straight away if he wants to, and I think that will leave him a healthy pawn up. First, he takes the rook on d1. Now he takes the bishop, and Finally, he does take the pawn on b2. So now he is up a healthy pawn. But the one positive for Vasyl Ivanchuk is that rook, which has moved into d7, attacking Grischuk's pawn on e7. And the knight from b7 could step back to c5 or a5, attacking Grischuk's pawn on a7. And Sasha Grischuk, with only the rook and the bishop left, will these pieces be able to defend all of the pawn weaknesses? Or will Ivanchuk be able to restore material equality? And imperceptibly, over the last few moves, it is now white who is up on time, and now Grischuk probably feeling a little bit more comfortable. He is now down 10 seconds as both players' clocks are creeping toward 1 minute, and what a move by Ivanchuk. Knight d8, locking down the rook on f8. The knight is preparing to jump backward toward c6 when the pawn on a7 will be attacked from two different sources as well as the pawn on e7. So Grischuk, he preemptively pushes that pawn out of sight, out of mind, but Ivanchuk says that pawn is still mine for the taking. Knight c6 with a double attack on a5 and e7. Now, which pawn is Grischuk going to defend? He defends neither. Instead, he focuses on activating his rook. That is an excellent move, because if Ivanchuk takes the pawn on e7 after the trade of minor pieces, Grischuk will infiltrate to c2, and it will be Ivanchuk's corner pawn, which will be under significant fire, but he decides to do so anyway. And I think Ivanchuk can play a3. No, Grischuk goes rook c4. I was expecting rook c2, but instead, he wants to position the rook on a4 and bring Ivanchuk's rook back down to e2, where it will be fully passive. But Ivanchuk says, I'm not going gentle into that good knight. He plays f5. He gives away a pawn, but in turn, he ruins now Grischuk's kingside pawn structure. Black is, of course, only the only one who can win this game. He's a pawn up. The rook from c4 is moving into a4 on the next move. And Ivanchuk has to decide whether he's going to defend the a-pawn at all. And he says, yes, I will. He plays rook e3 and a3 for the time being. His rook on e3 is actually pretty well positioned. It is cutting off Black's king. Black's king is going to have a very hard time crossing the e-file, and ultimately its goal would be to approach that a-pawn, because without winning the a-pawn, it is going to be very hard for Black to win this game. But Grischuk continues to put pressure as he pushes his pawn up to h5, grabbing space on the king side. He's making these moves that improve his position, but how is he actually going to make progress? He plays king g5, trying to infiltrate through the king side. Ivanchuk says, no, 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 king f3, and now back to g2. Grischuk offers a rook trade. Obviously, white cannot accept that trade. Rook to c3. The good thing for Ivanchuk is that he's got a lot of squares on the third rank that his rook can move to. But Grischuk's made some progress. His king is now on f4, and it's ready to move into e4. And it's ready to continue infiltrating closer and closer to that a-pawn. But the one positive here for Ivanchuk is that Grischuk's pawns on the king side are still incredibly weak. And Sasha Grischuk instead deciding to play h4, repeating moves with rook e4, rook c3. We've seen that before. Rook to d4. Grischuk continues to try to do something here. Back he goes to a4. And for whatever reason, he's hesitating, but finally he does, after more hesitation, play king e4. And he continues to try to inch closer and closer to that a-pawn. But Ivanchuk, rook to f3 is his response. And now king d4 would actually lose a rook to the skewer on the fourth rank. And so Grischuk has to step back with his king. This is phenomenal defense by the Ukrainian grandmaster here. Rook to c3, keeping 20 seconds on his clock. Back he goes to e3. And the problem for Grischuk is that even if his king gets to c4, there is no way that it will actually be able to infiltrate the third rank. It cannot get to b3 and apply more pressure on that a3 pawn. And this is exactly what we are seeing here as he has made his way to the queen side, but he still can't actually apply pressure on that a3 pawn. And that is why he vacates the a4 square. A great move there for Grischuk, but Ivanchuk cuts him off now along the b file. Back to f3 he goes. And once again, the big problem here for Sasha Grischuk, how is he going to get his king to the third rank? Is he going to play rook to d3 and sack a bunch of his kingside pawns? I don't think that's the recipe for success. Glancing over at the clock, Grischuk getting a little bit nervous here. I don't think he sees a way to make progress, and he finally does play rook d3. He sacks the pawn on f4. He sacks the pawn on f6, but he is going to capture. Finally, he's going to win that pawn on a3, and his passed pawn is going to be a lot further advanced than Ivanchuk's pawn on h3, and more hesitation there from Vasyl as he gives a check on b8, but Grischuk blocks it on b3, and I think Grischuk is going to promote his pawn, and he is keeping white's king cut off on the h-file. You can see those facial expressions from Ivanchuk as he realizes that this basically looks hopeless. Last-ditch attempt here, rook e8. He's going to give a series of lateral checks to Grischuk's king. This ain't over. a3 is met with rook e2 check. White's rook has been a hero all game long. Rook to c3, though, an amazing move by Grischuk. He prepares to cut. Oh, but rook b8 check. I forgot about that check. King has to move into c2. Surprise there from Ivanchuk with 3 seconds on the clock. He pushes his pawn, h5. Grischuk's pawn is very close to promoting, but he still has to contain Ivanchuk's h5 pawn. Is he going to play rook c5 and try to go after white's pawn? I think rook c5 wins the game, and he plays it. And now Ivanchuk cannot simultaneously defend his h-pawn and contain black's a-pawn, and he loses on time. What a game that was. And if you enjoyed that video, make sure to click the link in the playlist for more of these videos. Thank you so much for watching.